Okay, Andrew, you can go ahead.
All right, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the City of St. Catharines Heritage Advisory Committee Designation Subcommittee meeting for Friday, January 19th, 2024. The time's now 2:03 p.m. And seeing as we have quorum, I'd like to call the meeting to order. We begin this gathering by acknowledging the land on which we gather is the traditional territory of the Haudenosaunee and Anishinaabe peoples, many of whom continue to live and work here today. This territory is covered by the Upper Canada Treaties and is within the land protected by the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Agreement. Today, this gathering place is home to many First Nations, Métis, and Inuit peoples. Acknowledging this reminds us that our great standard of living is directly related to the resources and friendships of Indigenous people. Maybe even a little more significant today as we deal with these properties, to try to remember that all of these land title chains begin with treaties. Something I think about when we talk about designations and research sometimes. Just my own little thought there. So we'll move on to today's agenda. Do we have any additions or deletions to the agenda?
I'm not aware of any, so I think we're in good shape.
Hearing none, then may I have a motion to approve the agenda? Anyone? Brian? So Brian, moved by Brian that the designation subcommittee adopt the agenda for this meeting held on Friday, January 19th, 2024, copies having been previously distributed. In favor? Okay, that's carried. Move on to consideration of the minutes from the previous meeting on December 8th, 2023. Are there any questions, comments, or changes to this one? Okay, seeing none, may I have a motion to adopt the minutes of the December 8th, 2023 meeting?
Happy to.
Moved by Robert that the designation subcommittee approve the minutes of the meeting held on Friday, December 8th, 2023. In favor? And that carries as well. Are there any declarations of interest today? Okay. Seeing none, we move on to the business of the day. We have one substantive item, and James will take us through the rankings in the process and discuss next steps.
Thanks, Andrew. Let me share my screen. So everybody should have received the presentation that I'm going to show you right now. You should have received it in your email. One slight change was made. Brian caught that I put the wrong photo for one of the properties, so thanks, Brian, for catching that. But let me know when you can see my screen. Everybody can see that? Okay. So today is kind of the culmination of a lot of work over the last 3 months or so. So thanks everybody for your hard work and for doing all these evaluations. I know it's a lot of it's a lot of legwork. It's a lot of research. It was at a time of year when things are pretty hectic. Trying to do anything in December can be a challenge, and so I really appreciate the efforts that everybody made. So essentially, what we have now is a list or a prioritization list of properties that we'll now look at for designation. And the goal of today kind of is to go over that list, make sure we're all kind of happy with it, make sure that any properties that any of us felt strongly about that maybe ranked a little lower, we can make a little bit of an argument for why maybe it should be bumped up. And kind of come up with a finalization or a finalized list that we can bring to the Heritage Committee at the end of the month. And then from there, we'll do the task of trying to designate these properties. So some stats for you, because I thought some of these were really impressive. 134 evaluations, which I think is just fantastic. That's a lot of properties to do in 3 months. So yeah, I really appreciate the work that everybody put into it. Every property had at least 2 evaluations. Some had 3, which is great. So we had different perspectives on every property. It was interesting to see how the scoring went. Sometimes, scores were vastly different and others were almost spot on. So just interesting to see different perspectives. The average score was 16.7, and that was out of a maximum of 60. That might seem low, but thinking about some of the thresholds that were required to get to something like 60 points. We knew that a lot of these properties weren't going to get the maximum points. Things like technical achievement, we knew that there were going to be very few to no properties that were going to get there, right? So didn't bother me whatsoever that this was the average score. The point distribution, we had 15 properties that ended up with 20 plus points. We had 31 properties that were kind of in the mushy middle of 10 to 20 points, and then we had 13 properties that were 0 to 10. So a pretty even distribution, to be honest, which is kind of what you'd hope for, I think, a little bit. 28 properties had at least one high priority vote. So when everybody did their evaluations, they kind of at the end of it said, should it be a high, medium, low, or no priority? So 28 of the 60 or so got at least one high priority vote, and 19 of the top 20 ended up with at least one high priority vote. So that's really good, I think. So I'll kind of jump into the properties now. I'll just go through them all, and then afterwards we can kind of have a conversation about them. That just seems like the easiest way to go about things. So the top scoring property was the Malcolmson Eco Park greenhouse. This kind of surprised me a little bit, but it's obviously a very important property. And the nice thing about this property, though, is it is city owned. So we don't have to be as concerned as we do with all the other properties on this list. Even though it will lose its listed status at the end of the year, because it's a city-owned property, we have a lot of control over it. So it scored the highest at 45.5. So on each of these screens, you'll see the average score here at the top. The average physical value score, that's out of 21 maximum. Historical value, off the top of my head, I can't remember what the historical value was out of. I think it was out of 20, and contextual value was around out of 20 as well. So each one I've put who was rated by, just in case it's just there for reference. That way, if we want to talk about a property, we can say, okay, Brian, what did you actually think of this? And then I've also noted who made it a high priority property. So in this case, both myself and Brian viewed it as a high priority. So the second one, I don't think was any surprise, and to be honest, I thought this was going to be the top scoring one, was the Keg over on 344 Glendale. Very high scores in all of the categories. Nearby, there was 219 Merritt Street, just a really nice industrial building, scored highly in physical and historical value. On Welland Avenue, we have 15 Welland Avenue. This is just a gem of a building, I think. I was glad to see this one score really high as well. Then we have 38 Geneva. We kind of talked about this property maybe at the last meeting, or it was the meeting before that, because we were talking about 38 Geneva is technically this rear portion here. And I think what we kind of decided as a group was that this whole building should be looked at as a whole, because the front part of it is, from an architectural perspective, is a lot more interesting. And so my hunch is that when the scores came in, it really was evaluating the whole building, and I think that's how we should look at it, even though this portion technically isn't on our register right now. Then we have 347 Lakeshore. This was one of the buildings associated with the canal. 1660 St. Paul Street West, which is a really lovely farmhouse out in the West End. 3 Elizabeth Street, which is probably one of the nicest buildings on Elizabeth. 7 to 7.5 Embassy. So this one is part of, I think there's 7 or 8 buildings that are almost identical, that are built kind of on one block. And I think last time we talked about, how do we just look at this one building when you have 7 or 8 that are all pretty much identical and all have kind of the same type of features. And we'll have to think about that when we actually go through the designation process. Do we want to reach out to the other owners and talk about that? Talk about whether they'd be interested in a designation. We'll figure that one out, I think, because it's a pretty unique case. So rounding out the top 10 was Westminster United Church. Then we have 1 Welland Avenue, 46 Lake Street, 301 Queenston, 123 Albert Street, 260 Vine, 109 Albert, 37 Henrietta, 51 and 53 Welland Avenue, 180 Ontario Street, 97 Albert, and then we had a three-way tie here that kind of, the way I looked at this was, okay, our top 20 we'll have in front of us, I think, and that's what we'll want to bring forward maybe to the Heritage Committee. And so we ended up with a three-way tie at 21, and I thought, okay, I'll include these as well. So we had 12 to 12 and a half Elizabeth, 37 Elizabeth, and 82 Oakdale. So I also included kind of the next kind of set after that. So we have 8 to 10 Elizabeth, 137 Oakdale, 12 to 14 Montebello, 5 Elizabeth, 75 Lakeport, 89 Lakeport, 10 Montebello, and 85 Albert. And I included these just in case these, I have a feeling that some of these might be properties that we'll look at and say, oh, maybe that should be a little higher. And so I just wanted to make sure we had them up on our screen and we could easily access them without an issue. So in terms of high priority votes, there were other properties that fell outside of the top 30 that some people had places high priority, so I included them as well. So 362 Queenston. So essentially what I've done is I've initialed who made it a high priority. So if you're wondering what these initials are, so you know that's MH is Mark, obviously, and BN is Brian. 105 Albert, 16 to 18 Niagara, 193 Vine, and 2 Michigan. So that's kind of our top 30-ish or so out of 60 properties. To me, when I looked at the list, there weren't a ton of surprises that rose to the top. I think the rubric worked kind of how I had hoped it would, because I think the properties that you would expect to be, you know, ranking highly would be up there. But at the same time, I think there's a lot of properties kind of in that mushy 15 to 30 range where, you know, the difference between them could be pretty negligible. And maybe somebody feels really strongly about, you know, one property versus another, and I think we have the flexibility to be able to move things around based on how we feel as a group, because not everybody chimed in on every property as well, right? The evaluations were really only done by, you know, 2 or 3 out of the group, right? So if somebody else didn't have that property and feels strongly about it, we can always bump it up. So with that, I don't know who would maybe I'll pass it back to Andrew and can kind of start a discussion about these properties.
Mhm. Well, I guess the one thing I would say is process-wise, how do we want to tackle it? Do we want to give people opportunity to comment on those top properties, and also maybe bring forward ones that they feel are should get a little more consideration? And I say that because there's one there that I feel very strongly is undervalued. That's 2 Michigan that we were just looking at, and I apologize to the group. I didn't get my rankings submitted on time, but I did do a fair bit of research on a number of the properties, that being one of them. And for me, that would be a high priority one as well. So that should have 2 high priorities if I had been on top of things.
We could go, I could just quickly go through one by one. And I think some of these we're going to say, yep, that definitely belongs at the top, right? So I think we'll fly through the first few. And then maybe if we get to a point where somebody wants to speak up, that might make the most sense. Does that work for everybody?
Good.
Okay. So the Eco Park, I imagine nobody has any concerns about that. And it's a city-owned property anyways. So I think we're in good shape there. I don't imagine anybody would have any concerns about the Keg building. Similarly, 219 Merritt and 15 Welland. And by all means, if anybody does have an issue, please, you know, chime in and let me know. 38 and 2 38 Geneva and 2 Queenston. 347 Lakeshore. The one thing that I thought about this building was it's unfortunate that they've added this kind of, I'm not even sure what you'd call that, little addition to the front, which unfortunately really detracts from what was originally there. So I had rated this one a little bit lower and to be honest, when I looked at all the ratings, I had rated a lot of properties lower than everybody, but I think just my threshold, because I had looked at 60 properties, I think my threshold was just, you know, a little bit higher, and I was kind of, you know, it's hard to compare a building like the Keg to something like this, right? So when you're looking at 60, I think the scores end up kind of deflating a little bit. But yeah, that was my only concern with this property, was just that's unfortunate, I guess.
Mhm.
1660 St. Paul, which I think is a lovely building. 3 Elizabeth. 7 to 7.5 Embassy. 180 Queenston. 1 Welland. 46 Lake. Now, one thing with 46 Lake is it is really close to our downtown. And so it's a property that I'm actually going to flag for our heritage consultants for the downtown heritage district. I had taken it out of the heritage district boundary or potential heritage district boundary, or at least the study area, because what's around it isn't really reflective of the downtown kind of character. But maybe there's an argument to be made for it being within that study area. So it's something that I'm going to flag at least to our heritage consultant, and it's a property that maybe in 3 or 4 months, once the study is getting closer to the end, we can determine whether or not it makes more sense to pursue an individual designation or to lump it in with the rest of the heritage district.
James, could that also apply to the 2 Queenston property? Because if I remember correctly, it's right on the
Yeah,
border of the proposed district as well.
that's true. Yeah, we could do that as well. So that's a good point, Andrew. Thanks. 301 Queenston. To me, this was actually one of my favorites, one of my highest ranked. And I feel like there's more of a story here because you can see the historical value and the contextual value is both pretty low. I tried to do some digging and figure out more about this, and I asked Brian what he knew, and he was able to provide me with some information. But apparently it's a building that's based off of or it's a replica of a house in California, which seems very vague. And I wondered what the story was behind it, and couldn't uncover it, unfortunately. But I do wonder if it's if there's an architect associated with it, if there's a bigger story to be told, and it's also just a property that's been well maintained over the years. So 123 Albert Street. 260 Vine. 260 Vine, I do wonder what might be under this stucco. I'm not sure if we've ever seen any pictures or anything of it below that, or of what it looks like underneath, but it felt like a building that's maybe seen some alterations over the years. I don't know. Does anybody know more about it?
As far as I know, it's got a red brick core underneath the stucco.
Yeah, I
my
wondered if it
only,
had. Sorry, go ahead, Brian.
yeah, my only concern was the windows to the left-hand side of the front door on the ground floor.
Yeah.
I think those are like 1940s, 1950s windows, so that might have been an open porch that was enclosed at one point. But structurally, I think the rest of the house has been untouched. It's got all its 1860s features. And like I say, because it belonged to the macaroni king of St. Catharines, I thought it was a really important building. And we don't have too many Tuscan villas like this in the city either. I think this might be the only one.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, I wondered about the brick
James,
beneath. Oh, sorry, go ahead, Counselor.
sorry, I was just going to say, at least when I did research in our homes in Port de Lucie, I was always told that back in the early 1900s, most of the houses were clapboard. And then when stucco was sort of invented or discovered, then people put stucco over the clapboard just because it was not just looks, but because it sealed the houses because none of them had any insulation and they had balloon framing and so on. So Brian would know more. But
yeah, my hunch with this one is that, like Brian said, that there is a brick exterior underneath it. Just the arches, like you can see the arched windows and whatnot. Here, I'll zoom in a little bit more. It just struck me as a house that likely had, and maybe had kind of buff brick accents as well, which I think would be probably consistent with that Italianate kind of Tuscan villa character. Yeah, I just wondered. That's all. What was underneath? It's a interesting building though. It's definitely very unique. and the story behind it of it being kind of the macaroni magnate, it's kind of interesting as well. 109 Albert Street, 37 Henrietta. I was actually surprised 37 Henrietta didn't rank a little bit higher, but it got a pretty low score in terms of physical value, only 3. But it might be a property that merits being bumped up. I'm not sure. 51 to 53 Welland Avenue. 180 Ontario Street. 97 Albert. I personally, I don't know if I felt as strongly about 97 Albert. I know Brian really likes this one. It feels like a building. There's a lot of this style in just outside the downtown, and so I didn't personally rank it as high, but Brian ranked it as a high priority. So,
well, the only reason I gave it a high ranking because I know there's things that have been done to the house, like the bay window that's sort of lurking behind that vine-covered porch. Is a modern replacement. But because this was Fred Parnell's house, he was really important. He was a local businessman. He had his fingers into like everything. He was a grocer. He had a coal delivery business. He was our local MPP. He was UE loyalist background. He wrote newspaper columns. He was the first president of our historical society. I mean, you name it, he did it. So I thought, the historical connections for the house were fairly important.
That's fair.
Yeah, I didn't think, or I didn't put enough emphasis, I guess, on the historical and the importance of Parnell.
No, did I.
12 to 12.5 Elizabeth Street. I imagine this is one that Andrew probably would have maybe made a high priority as well. I don't want to put words in his mouth, but
no, the scores don't look too bad there to me. I think it's a matter of whether you'd tack on a little more based because of the Swayze brothers who inhabited that property, their family for quite a long time, prominent downtown merchants and so on. But I have an affection for that building, yes, for sure. It originally was one house and they subdivided it, but the scores don't look too bad. It's with maybe another check or two for it on the historical side.
Okay. 37 Elizabeth Street. 82 Oakdale. This was one that I had a lot of trouble with because it's both. I mean, it's an important industrial building, but there's not much really. Like when you're looking at it, there's not much there, right? Like it's and so I was surprised that the physical value score was quite as high as it was. I personally didn't have it quite as high. I think Mark really appreciated the building, so it was Mark and myself that rated it. So I think I brought Mark's score down in the average. But yeah, it's a building that's been altered over the years, and to me it wasn't a building that jumped out as one that necessarily merited designation. And if this one got bumped down, it wouldn't really bother me if we felt that there was another property that merited more. But Mark maybe can chime in when he arrives and let us know how he felt about it.
Interesting to know what his thought process.
Yeah.
What business was actually in this one?
Like
what made it so important?
I do have it written down. Hold on one second.
I guess being on Oakdale, it's probably, proximity to the old canals and stuff. So there's probably that importance.
Yeah, so it was constructed in 1896 by Thomas Wilson, who had an experimental calcium carbide plant here at Lock 10 on the old Welland Canal. Let's see. The plant used wastewater from the canal to generate electricity, and it smelted coal, coke, and lime in the carbide furnace, which is located across the road. So I guess there was another feature across the road. Shawinigan Chemical was in there afterwards and was there from the 20s to the 60s. And that's all I really have from the history perspective. So that would have came from, because this property I think has been on the register since at least 2009. And so they're probably even older than that, to be honest. So a lot of this information would have been pulled from previous, I guess, probably the 1996 inventory book that the Heritage Committee created. So I personally didn't do any digging into the importance of this company necessarily. Mark just noted that it was connected to the industrial history, so in his comments. But when I don't think Mark is here yet, but when he arrives, we can have a chat about it. So okay, so then we kind of get to our kind of next batch. And maybe it'd just be best if anybody has, if any of these properties kind of jump out as properties that they felt particularly strong about. On these, in terms of high priority, I personally like 12 to 14 Montebello. I think to me it checks off a bunch of boxes. It's an intact, very representative, kind of, and just really nice building, to be honest. I think even from a kind of craftsmanship perspective, I think I would rank it higher than some of these other properties that we have ranked highly, because I think the craftsmanship is there. It maybe doesn't rank as highly in things like history. From when I looked into the property, if I'm not mistaken, it was a lot of everyday people live there, right? It didn't have a Parnell who lived in this house, right, to kind of set it apart. So that was one that I personally felt strongly about. Does anybody else have any thoughts on any of the four in front of them right now?
I do as well, on Montebello, and the next slide, I believe there's another one on Montebello that are both purpose-built, or maybe it was the next one, I don't know. But there was another one in Montebello
10?
down here, both purpose-built duplexes, and both beautiful buildings. I didn't do a review on either of them, but I'm looking at them, and this type of building I think we should be looking at very seriously to preserve. And there are quite a few in the old part of town, and I think it would be a disservice if we didn't rate them a little higher.
Yeah, I personally liked 10 Montebello because it's aside from having that stucco coating on the outside of it, which it might be a frame building underneath, it looks like it's been virtually untouched.
Absolutely.
I mean, all the details on the porch and the transoms and the side lights and everything. I mean, I really liked 10 Montebello. That's why I gave it a high rating. And I also liked the one next door at number 12 and 14. I don't think I gave that a high priority for some reason. I don't remember why, but it's a nice house as well. So 12 and 14 and number 10 could be bumped up.
Yeah, Brian, you gave that one a medium priority. So
okay.
And so did Holly.
Yeah, I agree that it should be higher. There's some lovely homes on Montebello. I like the 10, the 12, the 14. There's the one with the turrets next door, but we didn't have that on our list.
Yeah, the one with the turrets is really nice as well. Yeah. Okay, I'm going to flag.
Sorry, if I could
these
just say
two.
one.
Yeah, go ahead, Andrew.
Just in terms of the two Elizabeth Street ones, those are both more modest properties, and again, I not to single out Holly, but she used the word beautiful houses. Cultural heritage isn't just about beauty, and the reason I like those two houses is while they're modest, they're very early representations of that street, which is a very important part in our a certain historical era of our city. And while there were no significant individuals living there, there was a whole generations of immigrants that fueled that industrial period of growth and the expansion of the city in the 1870s, 80s, and 90s. And I think that stuff should be valued higher. So I have no objection to the ratings on these. My problem is with the criteria, which is out of our hands. In this case, they're rated properly. It's just a shame that the criteria doesn't value certain things more and other things less. So again, I've said similar things before, but I'm going to throw it out there.
Sorry, I'm just flagging the Montebello ones just to on my sheet just so I can make sure they're easy to find later when we want to adjust the list. Andrew, was there, in terms of 8 to 10, because 8 to 10 is somewhat similar to 12 and 12 and a half. Is there one that you feel more strongly about, or do you think that?
Actually, you know what? I think I apologize because I had it reversed. This house is this Swayze house, and I
Okay.
think that this is would be a higher priority for me than the other one. And I do, just by virtue of having spoken with the owner on one side and walked through the other side of the property when it was available for sale. The inside does have quite a bit of character left, less so on the side on the right side there, because the people who basically flipped it, they modernized everything in an unfortunate way. Although the young woman who owns the left side is very has done a wonderful job preserving it, taking care of it, and it's gorgeous inside. So again, not relevant to our thing, but there's a lot there that's intact of the character of the house. So yeah, I'd move that one up instead of the other one. I apologize.
Okay, because 12 and 12 and a half really, like 12 and 12 and a half scored 17.5 and 8 to 10 scored 17. So they're virtually the same. That's why I asked if you felt strongly about one or the other, because I think you probably know these properties better than the rest of us. So, okay.
It's too bad with 137 Oakdale that they've put in all those new windows and obviously modified some of the window openings. So I mean, with that Second Empire style roof, I mean, that would have been if it was in its original state, it would have been a really nice house.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and we don't have a lot of Second Empire in St. Catharines.
Yeah.
And so I thought it was relatively unique because of that. Like 15 Welland obviously is an obvious one, but yeah.
And there's one on Church Street too, I think. Going down towards Court, it's got a nice Second Empire roof line on it. But no, there's not many of them.
I think 38 to 42. I think that one's designated. I think that's a part 4.
Is it? Okay.
I think so, yeah. Any of these 4 properties? We've talked about 10 Montebello. Mark had ranked
on behalf of them, but just take note of the 2 Lakeport ones. They are right down the street from to Michigan, which is on the corner of Lakeport, and I was surprised to see these rate higher than that. These each have their own interesting little history, but just in terms of architectural value and other things, I was really surprised that Michigan fell behind these 2.
Mm-hmm.
And I wouldn't move either of these up. Just that's context for the conversation that we're going to have in a minute.
Yeah, and I thought it was interesting.
On Lakeport, sorry, that house on Lakeport, I've been in it a couple of times just at the entrance there. It's an older couple that lives there, and they're probably in their late 80s, and I don't imagine that a lot has been done to the house.
Mm-hmm.
Didn't ASI do cultural heritage landscape study of that section of Lakeport Road?
I wrote it.
Did you? Oh, okay.
Yeah,
I was going to say they look familiar.
I did the straw for it. It was just flagging. We didn't do kind of an in-depth study on this street, but it was flagging properties that could potentially have value. And I don't know if that's why these ended up getting added to the register or not. This would have been
that's why that's why I have sort of overly researched them. It's because it was part of that process.
Right.
And then they got added to that project.
So I would have flagged them as part of that project, and then it would have been up to Chloe and the Heritage Committee, I think, to decide to add it to the register, and that obviously was the case. So, but I don't recall when we do those types of projects, it's more of a high level flagging. It's not doing in-depth research. So, unfortunately, I don't know. And whatever I might have known about it has long left my memory, because I would have wrote that probably 4 or 5 years ago. I was just looking at the scores actually, Andrew, and it looks like I sort of sunk to Michigan because we only had 2 evaluations. It was Mark and myself. and Mark rated it much higher than I did. So I'm just looking at my comments. Here, I'll put up to Michigan. I think my concern was the amount of alterations that have been done over the years. It's really, there's just a lot of modernization that's been done to it. And I think that to me kind of, that was my concern, that there were other buildings that were a little more, had more integrity. And so I think that's why I rated it a lot lower. I'm not sure, like when I look at it, I'm not sure, other than it does have a neat, this element at the rooftop is very interesting, and very unique. But a lot of the rest of the house, I was like, this looks more contemporary than it does, than a lot of, even if you look, next door compared to this, right, or this one, right? It's like this, for all intents and purposes, if somebody had said that was built in, the 90s, people would say, yeah, okay, I get it, maybe, right? But maybe not the 1890s, right? So just based on the amount of alterations, but that was my rationale, at least.
And that was a concern for me. Was and an area I haven't looked into is the degree to which it was altered. And if we could find some older photos of it,
Yeah,
that would be wonderful. But it's actually one of the. Sorry, should we talk about this one now?
sure, go ahead.
Okay, it's actually one of the two oldest, one of the two first built in that little subdivision along Lakeport there, and it's the only one of those two that's remaining. And the reason that subdivision is there was because the NST Railway built a railway track through John Christie's land and cut a piece of it off through his farmland, and there was a big lawsuit over that, which is part of the history of it. And their answer to having had it chopped off of their farm was to then put a subdivision there, which was timely because of the changes to the canal. The route of the canal opened up the transport, across the from the other side of Fort Dalhousie and made that side much more accessible. But the property itself has ties to a number of significant local individuals. The first being John Bowman, who was the son of a Butler's Ranger who had his land grant next door. And the property subsequently ended up in the possession of John Christie, who I don't hear a lot about in terms of St. Catharines, but he was Captain John Christie from the Royal Navy, and prior to coming to St. Catharines, he owned a plantation in Jamaica, and it was when the British government outlawed slavery. As you may know, a lot of the slave owners whose slaves were lost, they received reparations from the British government, and it was the selling of the plantation and the slave reparations that allowed them to purchase significant amounts of property in Ontario, including this property, which is maybe not the most comfortable piece of local history, but one I think that bears conversation. It was after he died that the property was subdivided by his daughter-in-law and his daughter and his son-in-law. His son-in-law being Daniel Freeman, who was a local lawyer and involved in business and property speculation and so on. But he's much more well known elsewhere. He and his daughter left. He and Christie's daughter left. Some say because she had her illness, but other people say because of Freeman's debts. So they took her inheritance and left. But he's known in California as the father of Inglewood, California. They with the land, with the money they took, they purchased a big property down there, which was ultimately subdivided as Los Angeles grew. And as you might imagine, they became extremely wealthy by probably more by luck than any expertise. But one of the first purchasers of land in that new subdivision was Stebbins Andrews, who built a few of the houses, or at least owned property that a few of these houses are located on. But this is where his family lived, and if you're familiar with the shipbuilding history, the Andrews had their dry dock right across the road there on that corner, and this is where the Andrews family lived for quite some time. Once he himself left, his daughters resided there for a number of years. So very significant connection to the dry dock, to canal history, to the Andrews family, and so on. And subsequently, the property was sold to the rubber factory, and they used it for they divided it up into apartments to be lived in by their workers, and so it remains today subdivided into apartments, but that was initially done to turn it into residences for the rubber factory. So again, another connection that house has to immediate local history. And as I said, one of the first two, the only remaining of those first two built here, and so sort of a significant part of that little Lakeport subdivision there, which doesn't get a whole lot of attention, but has a really interesting history in terms of both St. Catharines and early Port Dalhousie history. You know, we don't talk about the Michigan side as much when we talk about Port Dalhousie, and maybe a couple things get overlooked. But
wasn't it called Welland Hill Farm or something?
yes, it was. That was there's an old article from an early newspaper from the 1830s when it was purchased by Christie, and that they had a magnificent house back behind there, which is been gone. I think it shows up on the 1930s aerial photos, but not afterwards. So, but it looks like that was quite a gem. That's where the Christie family lived, their farmhouse. Yeah.
Thanks, Andrew. I think it's pretty clear, like you know, it has there's definitely a strong history behind it. I think the question is kind of the architectural elements of it, but I could see its score being higher, essentially, right? If maybe if there had been one more evaluation that had been submitted, and that would have bumped up the score, or I even just looking at the way that I scored it, you know, even if I rated the history a little bit higher, that would have bumped it up almost closer to where 10 Montebello is, right? So I think this is one of those properties that maybe was underappreciated, and certainly merits getting bumped up. I don't know how high it gets bumped up, because even if, you know, we're talking about moving a property from here to, I don't know, the 20 range, right? Like that's still relatively low on our you know, priority list. So when we get to to Michigan is the question, I guess, as we start researching these properties and going through a designation. So and it may be a property, like I know you feel really strongly about it, so I don't know if there's more research or you know, information that you think's out there that maybe we could shed more light on it, then we would have an even stronger reason to keep bumping it up the list, right? So,
well, whether moved up or not, it isn't one we would get to immediately. So if you're open to it, I would be happy. Like I said, this is research done a few years ago as part of that project. I'd be happy to go back to that and write it up in order to give people the opportunity to consider it, and then by the time we get to it, we will be able to actually look at that. But as I agree with you, even taking into account all this, it's not going to end up in the top 5. So, you know, it's one that we would get to at some point. So if you're okay with it, I'll just write that up and provide it, and people can consider it for what they.
Yeah, I personally have no problem with it. I don't know if anybody in the group has any concerns, but I so many of these properties, other like the properties that are higher on the list, are going to be the ones we're focusing on over the next, you know, 5 or 6 months, right? So even if by the fall, if you know, are able to compile a bunch of information and say, you know what, I think there's more here and we should look at it, then, you know, it doesn't hurt, right? It's nice to have that information at least to consider. So.
Yeah, that as you know, as long as it gets maybe a second look before the end of the year, then.
Well, and the other thing is, even though they lose their listed status at the end of the year, and we can't re-add them to the register for 5 years after that, you can designate after the end of the year. The issue, though, is, you know, if you tell somebody, you know, we're going to designate your building, they could say, well, we're just going to tear it down, right? So not that I expect that would be the case for any of these properties, but it's the risk you run, right? Is that we don't have that extra layer of protection. So at that point, you're kind of having conversations with the owners, right, and seeing how they feel about designation. Sorry, Councillor, go ahead.
Sorry, I was trying to unmute there. If I could ask a couple of general questions, because as I said, I have another meeting at 3, and I apologize if you've been through all this already. But first of all, I wanted to thank the group for, you've obviously done a pile of work on this. This is really appreciated, and not everybody in the city appreciates what we're doing here, but I realize that that took a lot of time. So thank you. Two big procedural questions. We've looked at all these properties. We got some ratings. James, do you have an estimate of how many properties we could realistically, pardon me, designate in the time that we have?
It's a good question. There's a lot of properties we have research on already, which is great. And to me, that's where the bulk of the work comes, right? Is doing research and making sure that you have a good enough argument for why a property merits designation, right? So we have to feel confident that we can defend any property if it were to be challenged at the OLT. So for properties that we have a lot of information about, those ones could go relatively quickly. The other ones, might take more time. If we were able to get one a month done between now and the end of the year, I think that would be pretty good. If we can do more, great. That's fantastic, right? So, yeah, if we try our best, if we can get one per month done, because the other thing is I don't want to put the onus on this group to have to spend so much time. Everybody's volunteering, right? So in terms of research and stuff like that, these things will take some time. And I have a lot going on as well, right? So I'm going to try to make it priority too. But yeah, my goal really, if we could get 10 to 15, I think that would be fantastic.
How does that relate time-wise to the deadline and that provincial bill, as far as from the time that they were put on the registry?
So all of these properties will lose their listed status by the end of this year. So we're up against the clock when it comes to that. But just because the clock turns over, at the end of the year, and will lose their listed status, they could still technically be designated. The issue you run into is, as of January 1st next year, these houses could be torn down if somebody came in with a demolition permit. So at least in the next 12 months, we can say, the property's listed already. You're not going to be able to demolish it. So that's good on our end. That's kind of our leverage a little bit. The issue is after that January 1st date, the leverage kind of shifts to the owner, right? So we have to be a little more careful and have conversations and see, what kind of appetite there is for homeowners to want to be designated. But that's part of mine and Margaret and Tammy's job, right? Is to talk to homeowners and see how they feel about this process. So, and we always reach out to the homeowners anyways, right? So, Andrew, do you have your hand up?
Yeah, I was just going to mention something along those lines. I mean, maybe we want to be practical on that level, and some of these, properties that are towards the middle, before we spend a ton of time on them, reach out to the homeowners. If you have a homeowner that says, "Oh, wonderful, I have a historic house, I love this idea," then that's one thing. If it's one that we say, okay, this will be harder to defend a challenge on, and you have a homeowner who is dead set opposed to it, maybe we just, again, being ruthlessly pragmatic, say, okay, we can't spend too much time here, and certainly if it's a borderline property, then the appetite of city council, I think, to push a designation on somebody can be virtually nil, and then on top of it, if we can see the obvious challenges to the designation, then maybe that isn't where our time should go. And I say that keeping in mind that after this massive workload, we have hundreds of other early properties across the city that aren't on the registry we haven't even looked at, and that's next year's problem. But it's always in the back of my mind,
Yeah, Andrew, I think that's a really good point that, and after we bring these to the Heritage Committee in 2 weeks from now, and they give the go ahead that yes, this list looks great, I was going to reach out to all the homeowners, at least probably in the top 25 or so, and find out, what kind of response I get. If we do get homeowners that are like, yes, I'm in, yeah, I think, if it's a low hanging fruit, we might as well take it, right? And the other thing that I always remind myself with this project is, as much as like all these properties are on the register and they all have some aspect of heritage value, we also have our downtown heritage district study that we just started up actually this week. We met with the consultants yesterday for the first time, and so we're going to, in a year from now, hopefully have hundreds of more designated properties than we had a year ago, right? So these properties are really important, but in the grand scheme of things as well, we're going to have an entire, hopefully, downtown that's going to have a level of protection as well. So in the grand scheme of things, I always try to remind myself that we're going to be ahead of the game compared to where we were before Bill 23. So it's important to get try to get these designated if we can. But at the same time, I'm always mindful that we're doing a good job at and we're making progress, and any win that we get is just a bonus, I think, in this case. So but my plan definitely was to send out letters to all the homeowners and get in touch and see where the easy kind of paths would be towards a designation of these properties.
Thank you for that, and thank you, Andrew, for that good point that you made. And just some clarification, keep in mind that what you said, James, that you have it on the registry, they can't demolish it. Of course they can. It just means that they have 60 days to apply,
Yes.
right? So
yeah, I
so
guess
it
what I
can't-
meant is, sorry, Councillor, I didn't
Yeah.
mean to interrupt. Go ahead.
No, that's okay. In other words, it's certainly a big step, but it doesn't guarantee. You've answered my other general question, which was about the downtown heritage district, and we will certainly need a good study there because we do have some councillors, including the mayor, usually doesn't like the idea. So we'll have to make sure that we have a persuasive argument. And my last point, because I have to go soon, is that when you contact these homeowners, if you send a letter first, you want to carefully craft that letter so that you also add some of the key points about the fact, the misunderstandings out there that they think that this is going to detract from the property or devalue it or whatever. If you can make some general points like that, it would help with your letter, I think.
Yeah, thanks, Councillor. It's myth busting is a huge part of the job, right? And so, and I think that goes for both this and for the downtown stuff that we're doing. So, and speaking a little bit about the meeting we had with our consultants for that project, they completely get it and they understand that that's going to be kind of an issue as well, right? So, yeah, the goal really is to try to make this a process that eases as many concerns as possible, because as soon as anybody hears heritage, they do get their backs up, and I know that. So the goal is to try to explain things like our grant program, right, that all of a sudden somebody, if they're designated, they have access to. So there's a lot of positives that can come out of it. It's just a matter of explaining them properly. So but definitely plan on doing that.
Okay, thank you, everyone. I have to leave because I have this other meeting, but again, I really appreciate the work that you're all doing.
Thanks,
Thank you,
Councillor.
Carlos.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Out of the houses they're on the screen here right now, of course I was partial to particularly 96 Albert. I think it's a little gem of a house, and it's got an identical twin standing right next door to it. And I mean, 96 looks like it's been virtually untouched. The window openings are all, the way that they were. It's just a really nicely maintained house. 16 to 18 Niagara, I like that one because there's 2 or 3 houses like almost side by side that are, 2 of them are like twin houses. I think the other one was it 12 and 14 Niagara. And then there's another one on the other side of it that's a little bit later, but I mean, those houses together are almost like a little bit of a cultural heritage landscape in a way, or a streetscape, if you will. 193 Vine, I think that's just a little gem of a house. You know, again, not really touched all that much. You know, the window openings and everything are the way that they were. The thing I particularly liked about that was that there's the carriage house out in the back. I mean, how many houses in the city do we have where you've got, you know, the 1870s house plus the original carriage house on the same property? And the one that I was surprised is not scoring higher is 362 Queenston. That's a really nice,
Beautiful house.
I think probably an 1860s, perhaps, brick house. And I think, don't quote me on this, but I think it might have belonged to the Bessie family at one point. And Bessies were, you know, an important early loyalist farming family. Started out centered more around the 10 Mile Creek, around the Homer area. So I think this was a Bessie house, but I'm not sure. But it's a really nice house, and I'd like to see maybe it get bumped up a little bit if we can.
I believe you're right about that, Brian. That's when I was researching, but didn't finish. And I think it was a Bessie family.
Okay.
It was a Bessie house. I couldn't really, and maybe it's just the sources that I had, but I couldn't find a lot about Bessie as being anything beyond being a farmer. Maybe there's more to his story that I just wasn't aware of, but I just couldn't find anything that made me suggest that you know, the historical value is really strong. So I think for me personally, it looks like both myself and Mark didn't gave it just a 0 for the history because I just couldn't find anything about him. I don't know if you know anything more about the Bessies or about James Bessie that maybe would bump up that score.
I know I've got files about James Bessie, but it's not anything that's sticking out in my mind right now, like that I can say, oh yes, he was, you know. But I still think it's a pretty important house.
Yeah, I definitely agree. You know, it's a lovely house. I think whenever I do these evaluations, and as I was going through them, I always think about, is this defendable at the OLT? You know, because each of these criteria will be, you know, challenged, right? And so the significance of a farmer, and Bessie might be important to this group, but having to explain that to an outsider, you know, why was Bessie important to the St. Catharines or to this community? If we don't have strong evidence for that, then that just gets thrown out the window, right? So that's always kind of my bar is, okay, can I defend this at the OLT? And I think that's why I think in part some of my scores are a little bit lower, because some of these things, like, you know, Bessie, just to me don't resonate as stories that are compelling to people outside of, you know, our little group, right? So maybe that explains a little bit of my mindset on these things.
And then with 193 Vine too, you know, I'm always partial to that property because there's, you know, a couple of one or two gigantic pine trees or something in front of the house as well. When you see it in person, I just think it's a really nice little house.
Hmm.
So those would be ones that I'd like to see, you know, get maybe bumped up a little bit, but definitely the Queenston Street one.
I think those are all good points, including
Mhm.
including the Albert Street one. I think there's similar to Elizabeth Street, modest house, but you know, representative of its an early, you know, early representation of an important working class neighborhood.
Right.
Sorry, I'm just marking these off on my sheet so we can flag them for later.
Well, I mean, originally you said that, like, the kind that you have is the one that.
Oh, Mark has joined us. Hi, Mark. How are you doing?
Good. How are you guys?
Good. We've been going through all the properties. There are a few that we discuss that that you actually had rated pretty highly. So we couldn't put words in your mouth as to why you rated them as high as you did. So
Right.
maybe I'll go back to a couple of those, and you can kind of speak to those if you don't mind.
Yeah.
But one of them in particular was 82 Oakdale, which is the factory building, the old the calcium carbide or something like that.
Yeah.
So yeah, so you
Got my
had it
notes here.
rated pretty high, and you had it rated highly in physical value and historical value, not as much contextual value. But do you want to maybe speak to maybe what, because when I rated this property, I had a lot of challenges just trying to figure out, okay, where is the design value and where is kind of the physical value there beyond it being an industrial building. But you had it rated pretty highly for some of those things. So
Yeah, to me it was all the piers and just the quality of the structure in general. Like you don't see buildings like this built like that. Um, like manufacturing buildings. Let me grab my notes here on what else.
sorry, didn't mean to put you on the spot, Mark, but
No, it's okay. That's what I'm here for. Um, let's see, that was near the beginning. You know what? What I didn't do was I didn't print off my uh my submission forms online because I found that when I rated everything on paper, because I've got like stacks of paper here, like there's like 24 sheets of paper here. And then when I was inputting them all into the digital format, it seemed like a lot of my scores may have dropped a little bit because of that. Um, uh, this one, maybe not. So this one was, it was okay. I remember there is a tunnel that goes to like from underneath this building under the street. And I thought that's very unique part of our industrial history in St. Catharines, right? It was very it served a big function. It was an experimental um, building as well to take waste from the canal and use it as in form of energy, if you will, right? So I think it was. I'm thinking of that like the industrial development of St. Catharines. It was important to me anyway, and the
okay.
physical structure was is just very unique. There's not very many of these standing in this shape. But I do see that there's room for development, say for houses in this spot, for sure. It's in an industrial area. So there is always need for like manufacturing space too, close by to neighborhoods.
Yeah, I think so yourself, so both me and you basically were the two people that were able to evaluate this property. And this was probably one of the largest discrepancies in scores between, so that's why like your score was 29 and mine was 6 or 7. And so it was kind of it was one of those scores where I thought, okay, well, I'm bringing your score down because I think the one of the if we went with the 29, it would be like a top 5 property essentially. And so
Oh, really? Wow.
yeah, so it was one of those cases where I thought, okay, I'm bringing this down a little bit because of my score, but yeah, it was just interesting. And I wasn't sure. I saw your evaluation and I have it in front of me, and I definitely understand the idea that it was really important in terms of how it was tied to the canal and industrial use and stuff like that, but I just didn't know some of the rationale for how high it was rated. That's all. So that's why I
Right.
wanted to ask. The other property that you had highly rated was 75 Lakeport. And unfortunately, the picture of it is not amazing because there's so much foliage in front of it. But I'm not sure if you remember that one.
Yeah,
if you
this
want to
one
speak to
was
that one.
just it's a very small, simple home, not touched much at all, other than maybe some cladding. It's just it was one of the first houses in a development at the time, and I think I may have scored it highly on its maybe more of its potential, on what we can find in this place, because it was one of the houses closest to the canal, so there may have been some importance of why it was so close for someone that was a builder or an architect of the of like Port Dalhousie and the canals close by. Again, I don't have those. I should have screenshotted or printed my submissions so I can have those as notes.
Let me just see
I
if
can
there's
add a
any.
little bit to that. That is one of the early ones. It was that was subdivided and built on in that it was Anthony Dixon was the owner that and Dixon his brother had a property there too, and I don't remember my notes who they were, but the Dixon family were prominent in not in a major way, but in some fashion. I'm trying to remember. I'm gonna have to go back to my notes to figure that out. But.
Yeah, because I look at these kind of buildings, it's like when there's only a few of them left that tell a story in that corridor from St. Catharines to Port, right? It's like to have something remain would be a good thing, because there's a lot of new builds like kind of peppered in between all these buildings.
So the other we just finished discussing 362 Queenston, which was another one that you rated highly, and I think we all agreed as well that it's a nice building that definitely should be kind of bumped up a little bit on our list. So no concerns there.
Yeah, again, anything to me like that's in a corridor that has been there for a long time, and it's like not necessarily a landmark, but like it's visually appealing, and it's like especially something like this, like to have that house on that corner was a big deal at the time, and it's still standing, and that's great.
And then the other one that you had mentioned that you thought was a high priority was 2 Michigan, which was one that Andrew also felt strongly about. And Andrew's actually going to do a little bit more digging into it over the next few months and see what else he's able to find. Because one of my concerns with the house was just the amount of kind of the number of interventions that have happened over the years, and the amount of original material still remaining. It just seems like it's been altered a fair bit. But we're going to see if we can uncover more information about the house, and then maybe look into it, look into a potential designation later on after we've done kind of the first batch. So
Okay.
Andrew's gonna take a look at that one. So yeah, so I think you're caught up to date now on this.
Yeah, I know I had 193 Vine too, but I don't know if I rated that one so highly. Again, I'll have to check my notes here.
Can I say something about the Oakdale?
Yeah, go ahead, Holly.
Well, while you were discussing things, like there is a lot of industrial history about Oakdale, and I was reading about how carbide, Union Carbide Works, first started at 82 Oakdale, and the inventor of carbide, Thomas Wilson, that's where he got the patent and sold to Union Carbide. But it said him and his wife lived in a hotel in St. Catharines for a year or two, while his factory in Meriton on Oakdale Avenue used power from the Welland Canal was established. So that's kind of a little bit of history there. That's for Oakdale Avenue.
Okay, that's good to know. Thanks, Holly. Are there any other properties that anybody wants to speak to, or any other thoughts that have crossed your mind?
The only house that I evaluated, and it hasn't shown up here on your presentation, that was a real disappointment for me, was the one on Simpson Road.
Hmm.
I mean, up until the present owners or recent owners decided to gentrify the house, it was a perfect gem of an 1860s, 1870s North End farmhouse. And now that they've, put this massive garage on the side and put faux stone on it and enclosed the side bay windows with rock. To me, I mean, the core of the house is still there, but they've ruined it a little bit. I mean, it looks like a nice house, but it's not true to the period. And I mean, that side turret there was all frame with the heavy side, the heavy brackets and stuff on it, and that garage was not there at the back. And I mean, why did they do that?
Yeah, Brian, I felt the same way when I was evaluating this property. It just seemed like too much had been lost for me to rate it highly. Yeah, it was unfortunate, but
I mean, the original house is still there, but it's not what it was. So that's why I just couldn't give it a really high score.
mm-hmm. This is the new garage here. You can see.
Yep.
So, yeah, I felt the same way, Brian, when I was evaluating it. Just too much had been changed over the years to really rate it highly, unfortunately. Are there any other properties or any other kind of thoughts that anybody else has? Otherwise, I'm just compiling the list of properties that we've sort of bumped up or think should be bumped up. And I think what we'll do maybe is we'll say the top. I'll share my screen again. Sorry. So I think maybe what we'll do is we'll say it's the top 20 or 21, I guess, because we had a bunch that were tied at 21, plus the properties that we've bumped up essentially, that are kind of in this mushy middle part. I've flagged which ones those are on my sheet here, and we'll send out letters to those homeowners. Or we'll bring it to the Heritage Committee, make sure everybody's on board. I don't see why they wouldn't be, but and then I'll send out letters, and we'll kind of tackle this batch. If we get through that batch, amazing, right? So that'd be fantastic. But I think there's enough work here that it's going to keep us busy for a while. So I feel pretty good about that. I don't know if anybody else has any thoughts about that idea, or if there are any other properties that
I misheard part of that. That initial list. How deep did you want to go down in this group?
Yeah, so I think if we go to the top, I guess we have top 21. So I guess this is 20, but then we had 3 tied at 21, and then we also add the 5 or 6 properties that we thought should be bumped up. So properties like 10 Montebello and 1214 Montebello, and I have them all written down. Basically, I've flagged them all. So we move those up as well into that batch. We end up with almost 28, 29 properties. We'll send out some letters, see what kind of responses we get, and kind of go from there. To me, that's a lot of properties. 28, 29. Even if we are able to tackle half of those this year, that'd be impressive, I think. So I think that'd be a really good start. Mark, you have your hand up?
Yes, they weren't on my list though, and I'm not sure if this is like a neighborhood designation, but the Woodruff area off of Ontario Street. There's a lot of there are a lot of beautiful old homes in there, and some Macbeth home, Nicholson's in there as well.
Yeah, none of those are on the register though, right? If I'm not mistaken. Like they're properties outside the register that maybe we'd look at in the future.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
So we might have actually, if we had been able to continue listing properties as we were doing before Bill 23, we probably would have got around to those ones, I'm sure, but that's okay.
Okay.
Okay, so I will. So we will need a motion, I guess, to see that these are the properties that we're bringing forward. It might take me a second though to get all those properties put together into the motion. So if you just bear with me for a sec.
So when it comes time to designate these structures, are we going to be working on the reports together as a group, or is the basic historic research going to be up to the people who have rated them to be working together in tandem on it, or how will we arrange that?
Yeah, I think we'll see what properties come back, or what kind of responses we get from homeowners, and then we'll have another meeting, obviously in February, and we'll talk about which ones we get responses from. It can be on a volunteer basis. It can be, if somebody knows a lot about that property or feels particularly strongly about a property and wants to do the work, then by all means. I'm obviously going to be helping as well, so I'll be heavily involved. And yeah, I think we'll take it property by property and figure out, what makes the most sense. Sorry, I'll just bear with me for a couple more seconds. Things aren't copying and pasting quite as I had hoped they would, so. Okay, there we go. So I will clean this up a little bit better when we bring this to the Heritage Committee. But for now, this is essentially our list of properties that we're going to start with as a part of our first batch. So I've included, so there's basically the top 21 that we had, and then all the properties that we flagged as properties that we felt should be bumped up. So what I'll do is I'll make sure that this is looking good for the meeting in a couple weeks. But for now, we'll need a motion essentially that this will be that the designation subcommittee approve the finalized prioritization list consisting of the following properties. So I'll copy that into here.
For the purposes of the motion, do you want them all listed in the motion, or
Yeah, I'm
can you
going
say the
to.
approved list?
We could say the approved list. Yeah, I just was trying to. I want to make sure that it's captured in the minutes later,
Yep.
in case we want to come back to them. So there we go. So not sure how well you can see it, but that the designation subcommittee approved the finalized prioritization list consisting of the following properties, and then they're listed below. Is that?
If you could make it larger, I'm happy to read them all, but
Yeah, sorry. This
it'll be a struggle.
So I can read them off if you'd like, if that helps. But
Okay,
35.
that'd be great. Why don't you do
Yeah.
that?
So 325 Lakeshore, 344 Glendale, 219 Merritt, 15 Welland, 38 Geneva, 347 Lakeshore, 1660 St. Paul West, 3 Elizabeth, 7 to 7.5 Embassy, 180 Queenston, 1 Welland, 46 Lake, 301 Queenston, 123 Albert, 260 Vine, 109 Albert, 51 to 53 Welland, 37 Henrietta, 180 Ontario, 97 Albert, 82 Oakdale, 37 Elizabeth, 12 to 12 and a half Elizabeth, 8 to 10 Elizabeth, 12 to 14 Montebello, 10 Montebello, 362 Queenston, 193 Vine, 96 Albert, 2 Michigan, and 16 to 18 Niagara Street. So that is our first batch of properties that we're going to look at. So we just need a motion then, and for somebody to make that motion, I guess.
All right, so yes, we consider that our finalized prioritization list. Would anyone like to move approval of that list? All right, Holly, thank you. So moved by Holly that the designation subcommittee approve the finalized prioritization list consisting of the properties read into the record a moment ago by James Nielsen. All in favor? And that appears to be carried unanimously. So that's approved. Good.
Great.
Fantastic. So having completed our one big order of business, we move on to business arising from the minutes. I don't believe there is any. Anyone have anything? No?
Nope, I don't think so.
Same items of correspondence. We have no items of correspondence. So the date of our next meeting is February 16th, 2024. Same time, same virtual place. And takes us to motion to adjourn. Do we have anyone who would like to make the motion to adjourn? Or terminate, is use the parlance of Mr. Nari?
Sure.
Robert moves that we terminate. So moved by Robert that the St. Catharines Heritage Advisory Committee, Research Subcommittee, be adjourned at 3:25 p.m. in favor.
We're having too much fun.
4-1. Committee member Nari abstaining, or sorry, dissenting. But I think it carries anyway, even unanimous. So
okay.
Thank you all.
Yeah, thanks all, and I've said it before, but thanks a lot for all the work that you've put into this. This was a lot, and I really appreciate it. I couldn't have done this without everybody. So yeah, thanks a lot for this.
Well, thank you, James.
Yeah, thank you.
Your guidance and all your incredible amount of work on this.
You bet.
It's recognized, and you know, this may be a group of passionate volunteers, but you're uniquely passionate professional. And,
Absolutely.
Your leadership and work is much appreciated. I think everyone here will agree with that.
Thanks all.
We're fortunate.
Okay.
Thanks again.
Well, we'll see you in a couple of weeks at the